All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Education 3.0 Research Network monthly webinar series where we've been unpacking and learning about all of the really amazing projects happening in the Ed 3.0 space. By Ed 3.0, we mean, the distributed and decentralized internet of education and all of the wonderful work that's being done to help bring us into the 21st century, more officially in terms of the infrastructure for education and employment. We started this about 4 months ago, the first of which was A for ASU and the Trusted Learner Network. The second was B for Broward and the amazing work that's being done there in the Broward Lab. And then last time C for the C Lab, or the Colorado work that's being done across the state there. And today we have the absolute pleasure to present to you D, the Digital Credential Consortium. And it is a remarkable effort, that is happening through MIT and many other amazing universities. And we're going to have a wonderful group of folks. So I want to just take some time here to introduce first Greg Nadeau, who is our wonderful founder here of the Ed 3.0 group, and he can kind of tell you what's coming up next and then present the panelists. So again, thanks everyone for joining, and join us again on the third Friday of every month. We'll have another one next time. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. So we're very excited to hear from this group today. In this time of COVID, I think we're all expecting that there will be an unprecedented wave of disruption happening in higher education continuing through next year. Many, if not all, higher education institutions will have a very different residential experience, if any residential experience at all. And so that will lead to a wave of expected closings of higher ed institutions, which will lead to a wave of transfers of students and just a tremendous amount of disruption that the technology that we're going to be hearing about today provides a foundation for how we can begin to address. So I'm looking forward to this presentation, and I'm going to keep on interjecting a little bit as we go along to, as we say in Ed 3.0, how do we make it real? How do we make this real? How do we show the concrete examples of how this can impact at the scale of the internet, the way that students learn at all aspects of their life? So Kim, do you want to introduce the panel and share your slides?
Yeah, so, and actually I'll do it in a little bit different order. I'll start with a brief introduction to DCC and talk about how we relate to other efforts, or ones, for example, that you've been talking about in these webinars. And then I'll end introducing the panelists and their specific expertise and focus, and why I invited them to come here with me. We have a great group in DCC who have a wide amount of experience thinking about and implementing digital credentialing schemes. So we're very lucky to be working together and working with everyone in the Ed 3.0 network. Let me start by sharing my slides. Okay, can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, so Digital Credentials Consortium, I'm joined by James Chartrand from McMaster and Matt Lyle from Georgia Tech. I'm Kim Hamilton Duffy from MIT, and we're here to briefly talk about Digital Credentials Consortium. Okay, so what is a Digital Credentials Consortium? We're 12 universities committed to standards-based learner-centric credentials. And we published our white paper just recently, February 2020, feels like years ago. What's interesting about the white paper is that we had a little innocent section at the beginning about why digital credentials for higher education. And I think that now we don't find ourselves being asked that question as much. So that part's kind of nice. No, there's no positives, but in any case, at least we have that established. And so, the good thing is that the people in this group have been thinking about digital credentials a long time. And fortunately, through the Ed 3.0 network, T3 Innovation Network, and our partners in Europe who've been thinking about this for a while, I think we have a really good baseline set up. There's still a lot of work to do. The Digital Credentials Consortium were very use case driven, and I'll get to a slide later on that talks about the phase 1 pilots underway. I have to the right the list of our founding members in the Digital Credentials Consortium. So we have a somewhat international set of universities, and all focusing on different aspects of the digital credentialing problem, which makes it a really good collaboration. So yes, I should start out by saying we are university led. Our primary focus is use cases in higher education, but we do see ourselves as part of the broader effort to bridge post-secondary and lifelong learning. And I'll talk about how we are achieving that in the next slides. And our goal is to contribute to an education landscape that increases learner agency, promotes more equitable learning and career pathways. So a brief note on our approach. A lot of us, all of us in the DCC had experience with digital credentials in different ways. Some of us use sort of earlier versions of standards that didn't quite address the problems that we needed to solve. So it's a combination of things. Maybe the schema wasn't flexible enough. Maybe the way that the learner was identified didn't really allow the learner to express control over the credentials. Or to have them be fully controlled by the learner, portable. Maybe they relied too much on the issuer to, permanently host and provide the credentials. So over time, with all of our approaches, and this is partially how DCC came about, is we're beating our heads against the wall, running into the same problems: flexible schemas, concerns about right to erasure, and that come about through privacy frameworks like the GDPR and other emerging regulatory frameworks. So we didn't think that anything was quite there. We're still not quite there, but we did identify that some emerging standards, the W3C verifiable credentials, W3C decentralized identifiers, were key parts of the puzzle. And as we'll talk about later, that's also being used by many efforts involved. I noticed Simone is on the call, and we've been working closely with him to put us in touch on the European effort side. But so given that some parts are still missing, what we wanted to do is, given that we're university led, we could really help push forward some of the missing pieces. So those include standards and protocols that I'll briefly mention, but then most importantly, learner focused tools and standards. We felt like, yes, there was good coverage on the issuer side, but where things really fell apart is what happens when you get to the learner and what it's like for the learner to share their credentials. And so we really identified a shortcoming there, and we wanted to address that. So we do work with standards development orgs. We're only one small piece, which I think the next slides will demonstrate a bit more. But then also we're working with the broader ecosystem, commercial partners, et cetera, to ensure interoperability and viability. So I do want to say, first clarify, what is the credential in verifiable credentials? Because I think in the education space, that means something very specific. But in verifiable credentials, long story, it used to be called verifiable claims. It's now called verifiable credentials. So now we get to explain it every presentation that the credential is just it's an assertion, it's a claim. It could be something like a passport. It could be like a bearer pass, like a ticket, or some kind of membership card. So that's what credential means in our terminology here. So why are we drawn to the W3C verifiable credentials standard? So we see ourselves, as we talked about in the white paper, we see ourselves very focused on the credential envelope. So not the content of the credential itself. I think that's very well covered by standards development orgs in education. So, IMS Global, PESC, on the US side, and then even more beyond. What we're interested in is the idea of an interoperable, verifiable wrapper, which we felt that verifiable credentials addresses. So we think about it in terms of the value it provides. So the metadata about who the issuer, the learner is, how to establish strong link those to even real world identities or KYC type of information depending on the use case, but that are also privacy enabling. Metadata that allows flexible proof mechanisms, information about the credential status, and then also that vocabulary. So here's a key part, is that linked data is very core to our approach. And what we want to do and what our approach is partnering to define what those vocabularies are, what the content is. But so, building up this interoperable wrapper that can store a wide array of content is really critical for interoperability of these credentials, and a standard way of gaining trust in the credentials. The ability to prove it's not been tampered with, the ability to link it to identities. And I do want to note a good progress, which is that this approach is being used as a basis for the ILR wrapper and the effort that Jim Goodell is leading. So we're very happy that that's happening. Another aspect of the W3C verifiable credentials data model, so the ecosystem, it puts the holder or the learner in the center of credential exchange. So this is a very key aspect of the design considerations, how proof and how trust in the credential is established. So one thing I do want to call out as well is it calls out sort of an abstraction around verifiable data registries. That's one thing that's evolved a lot over time, is our thinking about the role that blockchain plays. In verifiable credentials data model and implementation guide, you'll see a lot of details, considerations around privacy and security. In earlier approaches that many of us were working with, it didn't allow that sort of nuance and flexibility. So if you do want to have very, more high stakes credentials, things that might have personal data in it, there are ways that you do that are different from sort of the earlier approaches of just anchoring the credential to a blockchain. So I already touched on some of these, but we do see ourselves, in terms of specific efforts that we're working on, we see ourselves as having a critical role in helping expand on previous efforts. So verifiable credentials data model, decentralized identifiers is one piece of it. But I think there's still a lot of information to be learned about how these can be used in real world scenarios. How do you bridge these to, additioning legal frameworks like the GDPR? And then applying lessons learned from earlier blockchain-based solutions. I think it's still the case that we're all talking past each other. Is a hash of data on a blockchain sufficient for, anonymization? It's not, but you'll see a lot of the debates are kind of confined to Twitter right now, and how that goes. So I think we wanted to add more nuance and actually work through our partners to get some more specific clarity, also for commercial vendors, because it's hard to get that at this current state. What's missing in the ecosystem standards and protocols? So as I mentioned, we have the credential data model, the wrapper covered. I think that we're still in the early days of defining what it means to exchange a credential in, at scale. So for example, say that the learner suddenly has thousands of credentials. They're not going to go through a file browser and pick one and share it. So the verifiable credentials data model, through the notion of presentations or grouping of credentials, has the idea of building, working with sort of fine-grained credentials and aggregating them into a bigger claim. But those are still very, very early phase. So it's not just the exchange, it's the storage and indexing mechanism. How do you easily search your credentials to know what you have? Does it match what the relying party is asking for? Does it follow trust guidelines that the relying party has laid out? For example, which issuers they trust. More work around digital identities for issuers and learners. There's a lot of interesting work here in linking both to existing trust mechanisms, but in the case of a lot of work that I think Nacho Alamillo, and I can include links to this after, is doing, how do you link these digital credentials into real world identification schemes? So EIDIS is in that case that he's really looking into. But how do you make the identity parts of it real? Because otherwise we're just, building something that won't be used anywhere. Defining these flexible schemas and linked data, I think that's a big way that, the verifiable credentials data model has been a standard for a while, but I think in the education space, we're really plowing forward faster than others. And so I think we see ourselves as having a key part of connecting this work to education SDOs. And so more direct learner agency, I think I've covered that. But also, and I think most critically, the development of a transparent governance model that keeps the learner's rights at the center. And by working as a university-led effort, that's something that we can really push forward and make sure learner rights are the first concern. So I'm reaching the end. So how do we work? How do we try to pull all of this broad effort off? Because I talked about a lot of things, a lot of efforts, but again, we're really focused on our initial use cases are, higher education scenarios, credential envelope, partnering for everything else. So how do we do that? So one, I should call out, we're very committed to open source, open standards. We're engaging with the public through W3C, Verifiable Credentials for Education Task Force. We've had some good attendance from both industry and groups that are attending here, education standards orgs. So we're collaborating with standards groups and networks. I think a lot of those are called out to the icons on the right. So W3C, IEEE, which I think we talked about in some of these webinars in the past, Decentralized Identity Foundation. In terms of the content of credentials, there are groups like PESC and IMS Global. And then I think one area where we're really benefiting is that a lot of the EDCI, European Digital Credentials Infrastructure, and related standards groups they've been working with verifiable credentials. And as I mentioned in the case of linking verifiable credentials DIDs to EIDIS, I would say that a lot more work for vetting these solutions to real world uses are more mature. So we've been fortunate to be increasingly partnering with many of these efforts and learning from their success. And then lastly, networks like the T3 Innovation Network is how we're a large part of how we're identifying partners to work with to make sure it's real use cases. So yeah, I think that those sort of partnerships are where we see ourselves as creating a vital ecosystem of options. So DCC is not developing commercial products. We want to make sure that the standards are being developed, especially the thought around the learner side, so that there is a ecosystem of options, so that the learner and so that no one is locked in to solutions. So, and we're doing that by partnering with a range of people. I think I'll just skip past this. This is from our white paper, but it's sort of calling out how how our efforts work. So, we have the open source libraries that are issuing the open standard services that we can stand up, but these are items that commercial partners can either use. They can either just directly write the standard, they can use our libraries or services. We're also working a lot in terms of integrations, linking to learner identity methods, authentication methods for the university. But then also, more broadly throughout the university, the student information systems, any other sorts of, of data systems, both on the incoming, so the admissions and outgoing, registrars side. So here's where it gets real, Greg. This is this is the magic. So we're, as I mentioned, very use case driven. I think that a big missing piece is with all of, a lot of what we've seen in verifiable credentials and related efforts is that, people will sort of stop at the user, or maybe even like the learner is showing the credential in their wallet, but what do you do after that? Sharing on LinkedIn is great, but after LinkedIn, what do you get? Does anyone trust that thing that you put on LinkedIn? Does it help you get a job? So we want to make sure that we're exercising each leg of the path. And so we're doing that in true to form. Our pilots are working in a very decentralized way. So for example, University of Milano is working on solutions that integrate with EDCI and Europass 2. But let me call out a specific end-to-end scenario. Let's see. So, okay, here we go. So I won't, I'm not sure I'm allowed to name names of companies yet. So, but one pilot that we're working on is the idea that, okay, so there's a specific company that likes to hire, students for internships. So before they hire them, they have to know for sure that, one, they're a student, two, they are an undergrad versus a master's student. So these are required for these are regulatory, and they determine the pay. Right now it's a, phone call manual kind of verification. So what we're doing is working with the issuer to issue exactly those credentials, going through the learner, so that the employer, and it's going through a applicant tracking system, can verify, yes, they're a student, they are a master's versus an undergrad. So that's an interesting path, because we're going through, the issuer, the learner, applicant tracking system, onto the employer. And, so we're starting small. That's not everything that the employer needed to know about the student, but that's a critical piece, the critical piece that they had to manually verify before that they can get out of the way. Georgia Tech, and this is one reason I'm very excited to have Matt Lyle here. They've been working heavily on usability pieces. And so they've had some students that are focused, they've done studies already about usability and more specifically non-usability of existing digital credential wallets. The idea that, the terms that we use are still really informed by, say, like Bitcoin wallets, and they're not intuitive to people in terms of notions of higher learning. Let's see. I'll move on, and then we can come back to that slide if interested. So how do you work with us? We are, well, as I mentioned, working through those groups like T3 Innovation Network, the various standards groups, but then also we have our Verifiable Credentials for Education Task Force meeting every Monday. I have a link at this location. And I have our DCC resources available here. I'll share these slides after. And so who are we? I'm, as I mentioned, you've heard a lot from me. I'm the architect. I'm very involved in a lot of these standards group, co-chair of the W3C credentials community group, on the DIF steering committee. In the past, I was a co-creator of block certs, which is partially how a lot of us on the group got here. We're all working on block certs implementations, beating our head against the wall for things that didn't quite work with that model. I have James Chartrand from McMaster University. He is a co-chair of the W3C Verifiable Credentials for Education Task Force, and he architected and implemented McMaster's digital credentialing solution. So I think that he's, from his experience, and I think more broadly, McMaster as a university has done amazing work. They're very all in to learner-controlled credentials. So I've been really excited to have McMaster involved. Their registrars, their executive team, everyone is very much committed to making this real. So I think that I'm excited because we have a real opportunity to work with them and understand how best to integrate these into their systems. And then we have Matt Lyle, Director of Digital Learning Technologies. I'm forgetting this acronym, so he'll fill me in, but he's from Georgia Tech. Very involved in creation and development of technology enhanced learning experiences. And as I mentioned earlier, he's been focused for a while on usability of digital credentials and tools to manage them. So that's us. And at that, I'll turn over for, I guess, Greg to take over.
Well, James and Matt, do you want to come in?
Hey, everybody. And I was just going to say, I think I saw, oh, never mind. I was going to say, I thought I saw that James went away, but he came back.
So Matt, do you
Sorry.
want to?
My connection might be a little iffy. Sorry about that.
Who would like to start? Matt, James?
Hey, so as I can go first, as Kim said, I work this. So the acronym C21U stands for Center for 21st Century Universities, which is a mouthful. So we just say C21U. But prior to joining up with Digital Credentials Consortium, we had been piloting block certs and at Georgia Tech, and primarily for non-credit bearing type activities, seminars, professional development, things like that. But then I guess last year was when we really got started working with some of our master students in our human-computer interaction master's program to do some UX research on the idea, starting with the idea of specifically about block certs, but kind of expanding more generally about digital credentials. So yeah, so that's me.
James?
Thanks. So as Kim said, I'm at McMaster up in Canada. And as she said, we've just got a kind of a very lucky situation here where we have a lot of buy-in from the university. So we've been able to make a lot of good progress. We started in on this, I guess, a little bit over a year ago with block certs and issued degrees last spring for a subset of the university and just for engineering students. Because a lot of what we're doing is supported by the engineering faculty at McMaster. But now this spring with COVID, the registrar has decided that they're going to push ahead and issue all degrees across McMaster using the same system, which is great. We are at the same time very fortunate to be working with Kim and Matt and the other people at the consortium on this new system for a couple of reasons, but the main one probably is that people at McMaster and the registrar especially are very keen on moving towards transcripts. At the moment right now, we put the degrees up on the anchor for the degrees is on the Bitcoin blockchain, which is fine because it's public information, but with the transcripts, it's clearly more private and people just aren't comfortable putting up that information, even if it's a hash. So we're very hopeful that with this new system, we can move towards transcripts and also then move our degrees onto this new system as well.
Okay. Well, James, maybe we'll just keep with you for a second. So that sounds very real, right? That's
Yeah,
all,
yes.
all of your diplomas, you said, right? All of your, so just the
Yes.
diplomas.
Yes.
But so I guess the question is, it's a couple questions of, so as you think about how to get the transcript, and do you have a way of thinking about sort of what people call transcript versus resume, which is a transcript being an immutable whole that cannot have selected parts taken out, whereas a resume is a user selected curated version of their life? Any thoughts about that?
Sure. Well, first off, in the spirit of keeping it real and concrete, initially, I think the registrar would be keen just to have even a PDF that's been signed. So this gets to the idea of what the consortium is doing with the envelope. And into this envelope, we can put, quite simply initially, probably just the PDF and have it signed by the registrar. And then that can be given out to employers or whoever who can instantly verify that it came from the registrar. Looking further down the road towards what you're talking about, there's certainly interest at McMaster about doing things like that, especially from the dean of engineering, Ishwar Puri. He's very keen on moving towards micro-credentials and kind of re-examining the curriculum and looking at how it can be broken up or recombined. But initially we have a very concrete focus, and that's just to move what we have now, the degrees, into this new system, and hopefully also to get even just a simple copy of the transcript up.
Well, just on the
I can add something on the competency side. So UC Irvine, our close contact of ours there, has been working on that for a while. That's, as you know, it's incredibly challenging. So fortunately, we have someone that's been thinking a lot about, in a course description, how do you define what sort of skills and competencies you expect the learner to have at that? And she's been kind of banging this drum with the professors there for a while. And so I think that that's some of the best progress I've seen in terms of, starting to get that information. So I think we also need to turn around and see what is it, how do we define the sort of reusable vocabularies, and so what do we point to there? How do we capture those? I think that's something that we're eager to partner with some of the broader groups here on that, because I think that that's where less of our expertise lies in terms of these taxonomies that people are using. But I feel like through the UC Irvine pilots, we can start having a very good use case from actual course data. And, like you say, even better, mapping that through to what is the skill that an employer would honor and accept, because the critical part of that, and one thing that I should clarify, I probably haven't clarified before, is even though we're a bunch of 4-year universities, I think that there's a lot of buy-in that the current model is pretty broken. The idea that you have to wait all the way to the end of this 4 years to get this degree, and the idea that, well, increasingly will happen, real life happens, your opportunities to really focus on education, traditional education, may get interrupted. And so what are the skills that you can take and capture with you? I think that that's a very critical piece, and will become, we have a really good opportunity to start pushing forward there.
And that's excellent, because as we know that in America, approximately half of the students who start higher education complete. And so for basically half of those who are higher ed students, you get debt but no degree, right? So how do we make that every step of learning along the way is a meaningful step that can help them along their path to lifelong learning and help connect them to other employment opportunities? So Kim, so if the McMaster's is able to do all of their diplomas, what about MIT? How long will it take for MIT to have all diplomas issued in the way that McMaster's are going? What's your thoughts? What do you think? Is that a year from now, 2 years from now? What do you think?
It'll be soon. Yeah, so I would imagine that it's yeah. So there's a combination of how we're getting there. So a lot more are happening now just through the sort of system that's already set up, but it's not quite set up yet. It's similar to James' case. You know, people can do degrees, but then when it moves to higher stakes things, transcripts. You know, there's still work to be done. I think that we're very close to that. So I don't want to commit to a date on air, but it's very soon. And yes, I tend to be very realistic about these things, and so I don't overhype. So
If I could just jump in quickly, I mean, what we're using at McMaster is something that you know, Kim and the people at MIT built. So we're using what they did, and we were very fortunate to be able to pick up their product and block certs and drop it into our system amazingly well. So we owe a lot to them.
Okay, let me just go to Matt. So, you know, Matt, ACRO, which is all of the registrars in, I think, just the US. I'm not sure if they extend to Canada. You know, they've just announced that they're ready to go with an adoption of the IMS Global Comprehensive Learner Record. What's your thoughts about Georgia Tech? How fast can your institution go? And what's your prediction about how fast the entire industry of higher ed can move in this direction?
Well, so as far as Georgia Tech goes, our focus with digital credentials has been more on the non-academic side. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of our earlier pilots, a lot of our focus have been on with Georgia Tech professional education and with just not the non-academic side of things at Georgia Tech. We see that as a really good place to move quickly and to start and pilot things and then move into the academic side. So we're not as far along as MIT and McMaster as far as when it comes to issuing diplomas and things like that. Yeah, I think so. One of our grad students just finished up another round of usability interviews with a group of Georgia Tech students, and these were done sort of during the heat of the moment with COVID is over the last few months. And one thing I thought was really interesting, I think this gets to your question, Greg, about how fast things will happen, is the students this go around was a lot more talk about, I need real time and I need fine grain. I need to be able to express my skills and I need to do it right away. Like Kim said a moment ago, waiting 4 years is too long, but for these students that, granted this was a relatively small sample because we were in the middle of COVID, but this group of students, about 8 or 9, every one of them thought waiting to the end of a course was too long. They needed to be able to say the week after they've obtained a skill that they can express that to someone in a verifiable way. So to me, that feels a little different than some of the past interviews we've done. There's a lot more urgency about being able to express my skills and my expertise from these students than there was in the past. And the other interesting thing too that I think will probably have a big impact on what we do is there's a lot of talk about, I don't necessarily, there is a difference between how students describe credentials and how faculty, we just finished a round of faculty interviews as well. And students talked about, I'd like to get a credential that just says I'm a beginner at this thing, or I'm just starting at this thing. Whereas faculty's mindset is really like they have to show a level of expertise before I'm comfortable issuing a credential. So I think there's things like that, and that perspective from students about, I want to be able to show right now that I'm a beginner at this thing, but I'm getting started, I think is also being impacted by a lot of the changes going on with our economy and our job market and things like that. So anyway, I feel like, as you said at the very beginning, that our current state of things is going to move this initiative a lot faster. And I'm also hearing that from these students in these interviews we've been doing.
Excellent. So I think Matt Hailstone, can Matt be unmuted? Matt, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, Matt. Please go ahead.
Yeah, excellent. I appreciate that, the opportunity. So just earlier, they talked about, Kim talked about GDPR, right? And there's two aspects I just wanted to bring up: the learner and their request to be forgotten, but also the education institution and their need to be able to have some type of record, right? I'm not sure if it's just this individual was asked to be forgotten and that's all that we can hold, but at least some kind of record that we know, okay, this person, we have some type of an experience with them before and previously. I'm not sure how much PI information would be needed to be able to identify the individual, but this kind of like the protect the interest of the institution, but also fulfill the request for the individual kind of competing needs or interests there. And I'm wondering if verifiable credentials can help in that scenario on both sides of the story. I'm not sure how, but kind of bringing up a use case.
And I'm going to ask you to ask that question again, a little clearer, if you don't mind.
I get what he's asking.
Okay, good.
So, and apologies, I think the pug snoring is getting kind of loud, but so, okay. He's talking about the idea that I mentioned the right to be forgotten as provided by GDPR, but there's pressure in both directions. You know, the right to be forgotten, if you send a request, you're not guaranteed it can be erased. Sometimes there's a public interest or whatever in that data being retained. So, you know, how do you balance both concerns? And I really like this question because I think it hints at, okay, so a lot of what the standards that we're talking about are associated with, you know, sort of a movement called self-sovereign identity. And, you know, self-sovereign identity is, you know, the idea of putting the learner in control of their data, but it's sort of a not really up-to-date term. I think that what I've realized over time is I think a lot of the original framing of it is kind of flawed because you might think of it as based in like the 1990s kind of use cryptography to solve everything, leak no information to no one, everything is private. What has been a real gap in the sort of technology-led approaches is that we lack the nuance to apply to real-world scenarios. So this is something that came up a lot through our work with T3. So the FERPA people pointed out, you know, what about all the special cases? So they would hear people talk about learner controlled, and they would say, well, this contradicts this FERPA regulation. And I think one thing that we need to get clear with sort of this wave of application, and what I feel like we're doing through through this network, is realize the role that technology plays, and realize the role where regulatory, including local considerations, plays. So verifiable credentials can work with that. I think that that's another key element of being very use case driven. So even amongst our university members, there's pressures, like you mentioned, in both directions. So, you know, the European ones, of course, there's GDPR. Sometimes transitively those spread as well. Some issuing universities have a requirement to hold on to the records for a certain amount of years. Some might have requirements to, you know, delete after a certain, not hold on to after a certain amount of time. So I think these things we need to have it so that these types of concerns that are more regulatory and, you know, context sensitive in nature, so that there's a role there, which, you know, a combination of, you know, verifiable credentials sort of having its boundary of what it can solve, but not expecting it to solve the full story. So I think that that's another area where we've gained more knowledge over time. One thing I'll point you to there is Barbara Nissenbaum has a notion of contextual integrity as it relates to privacy. I think that that's a really interesting model that I've seen pointed to help describe the different privacy concerns that are relevant in different cases. And, you know, there's also kind of more formal models that sort of talk about how we can talk about credentialing and identity in these contexts. And so, so yeah, I think that we're finally making progress on broadening the conversation so that everyone that needs to be part of it, not just the technologists, are involved.
Excellent. We have a question from Mary Strain here. She says, might we want to consider the pedagogical frameworks for how competencies are assessed and recognized so that the credentials are recognizable through existing paradigms of achievement to those outside the issuing institution? Do we run the risk of issuing so many verifiable credentials that they lose currency and value outside of the university? And I'm gonna actually start with, Kim, the conversations that you and I have been having the past few days, which is directly about that, right? Which is that, I come from a background of focusing primarily in K-12. In K-12 in the US, we've had standards, state academic standards, detailed, like about 100 statements per grade, per subject, and then a summative assessment at the end of each grade, right? Very, very concrete. Now that's sort of the opposite of the university experience, where in many ways the culture is that the more sui generis the professor's area of research, the more exceptional their research is received in the community. So the idea of making it a commodity where your course is directly translated into someone else's course, and maybe it's not exactly the same, but you ultimately are saying there's 87% of that course that translates, and if you do the remaining 13%, then the credit transfers. That's sort of counter to the culture often of university, but we've been working in K-12 and on CASE, the Competency and Academic Standards Exchange. I think we have a really robust standard and open source tool stack and registry, distributed registry. What is the way that you all think about how this is going, just both culturally and technically, how you can get to the point where you can say, let's say, if we just said, let's start with every introduction to computer science course in the country. And just those, if we could just make those explicit about what the course objectives are in that course, and then use AP Computer Science Principles, Computer Science Teachers Association, and other national frameworks to kind of hub and spoke create comparability. What's stopping universities from doing that, and how can we accelerate that?
Yeah, I can take a start at it. So I think that that's an area where I see ourselves as we are not really in the position to define those, but I think we have a strong advocacy role that we can take. So I think on a couple sides, the thing that I noticed in terms of even constructing the courses and what are the skills that you expect to get out of it, the instructors aren't necessarily set up now to think about it in that way. That's slightly different from them. So I think that there's, education that needs to happen, I would say both directions, but many directions. So there's the idea as what's happening with BC Talent Cloud, getting employers to be precise about the skills that they're looking for, as opposed to the generic things that we see nowadays. Rock star React developer or something, so specifically what are you looking for? So there's that side, there's when you're constructing the courses, but then there's also the part that I think Mary was talking to as well, which is how do you make sure that there's some mapping? So you mentioned one way to do that, but I think there's also the idea that as an issuer, how do you know which ones are valuable? How do you know what to issue? I think the way I see it is that there's that work, it's going to take a while. I wish it could happen very fast. I think that we'll be in a situation where, we won't know everything up front. And so one aspect of it will be that as issuers, we can support different formats. Now that's not helping the problem that maybe Sing is making it worse, but in terms of what a relying party is asking for, part of these exchange protocols is saying, like, these are the skills that I recognize, these are the vocabularies that I recognize. So making sure that these use cases are known and pushed back to the issuer. But then in some cases, those can be addressed through mapping. and things like that. But I think where I really see us working is the advocacy role, drawing attention, both in our choices and making that very public what we're doing, but then also pushing on all directions, like at the and internally and the instructors, sort of with our partners, trying to pull up what those requirements are. But I think that the real heavy lifting is in the orgs, education data standards and related orgs that are actually defining these. We need to be in a very tight loop with them and making sure we're doing the right thing.
I want to go to Matt and James about this, but I do want to just acknowledge Brant Red, who's on the attendees and is doing some really spectacular work with T3 Network, creating a technical translation between the different machine readable competency formats. So there's both a technical layer in terms of translation, then there's a content layer of translation. And so both of those types of things are underway. And so but let me go to Matt. Do you want to talk about examples of where ontologies and taxonomies are defined in machine readable formats in your university?
Yeah, well, I was pointing over here because Mary's question is popping up over here. I was also going to mention the project through the T3 Innovation Network that's doing some competency mapping. I think that's really interesting. I mean, Mary's question was, do we run the risk of losing some value and it being somewhat commoditized? And I think we definitely do run that risk. I think one of the things I like about the DCC when we first started learning about them was the focus on learner control, and just really putting it in the hands of the learners, how they present, who they present to, how they package. And so I think from the learner's perspective, some of that's mitigated because they're able to control what package of, the idea is that they will be able to control what package and what combination and what types of credentials they present to others. But then Greg asked what's stopping universities like Georgia Tech. And I think it's less of a technical hurdle and it's more of a design consideration. I think just the know-how or the time or the incentive for faculty to be able to design their courses in a way where they clearly outline their competencies and their learning outcomes, and that it's and that sort of the DNA of their courses are clear. I think that's one of the biggest hurdles, because I just don't think we're set up. Many of our faculty aren't set up to be able to do that.
I'll acknowledge also Dan Gohl, who's on the attendees and for whom is really pushing the envelope in how we look at non-academic machine readable competencies as well. So some of the work that he's brought in with the algebra project and really looking at persistence and a lot of the key enabling social emotional behaviors that are arguably even more important for equitable access to education across the ecosystem. But James, do you want to talk any more about competencies and machine readable versions and how you see that next semester?
Well, one thing I'd say is you had a session, I think maybe 2 months ago with Phil Long, and I thought he described it really well. He said it was overwhelming with goodness, overwhelming people with goodness, which I think is exactly right. I mean, if you've got a gazillion, I'm just saying what everybody knows already, but if you give out a gazillion credentials and there's no clear way to judge them or to compare judgments, nobody's ever going to be able to use them. So you imagine a recruiter at a company, they don't want to have to make judgments. They want the judgments to be made for them. That's what a degree does to some extent. And they just want a yes or no answer. They don't want to have to dive in and look at all the great things that people did. I think typically those things would be shown during the interview. I'm by no means an expert on that. It's just an opinion.
Also,
I will say one thing. Because the work at McMaster is a lot of it is falling within the Faculty of Engineering, there is a process by which engineers are accredited, and in Canada, at least, I imagine it's the same across the States as well. And there's, I think, a very well-defined set of criteria And so we've talked a little bit about that at McMaster, at about possibly defining micro-credentials for each of those different pieces, which are already well defined. But again, getting professors to buy into that, or, I think would be very difficult.
Well, we'll see whether the new economic conditions, if there is, as some people have hypothesized, a massive higher ed bubble, and that's going to come crashing down as escalating costs far beyond inflation and declining completion rates expose this gap of people saying, really, $78,000 for that, in America, so maybe we're going to see new things, right? Maybe we're going to see new, much more value-driven approaches, and maybe those will leapfrog into the future. When we think about the digital wallet, right? And I guess you could take the wallet analogy and say, okay, I've got this digital wallet, but it's full of these non-exchangeable gems, right? And they're like pebbles. And now I've got like 1,000 of them. And so now I go and I want to now, in my wallet, go make a transaction with someone else. And so I've got my 1,000 gems and I want to now go and exchange them with you, right? It wouldn't be a very efficient economy, right? What you need is they need to be machine readable, quantifiable to a degree, and they need to be exchangeable. You need to be able to say, I've got this thing and it rolls up into this other thing, and now I want to exchange that thing with you. And the same way in your wallet doesn't need to be that everyone uses the same currency. This idea that we need to kind of wait until there's one agreement about one master taxonomy of learning. No, it can be just that there's an exchange rate. I've got my currency, you've got your currency, we agree on an exchange rate, and now we can make these transactions occur. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, or whether we should go to another issue.
Well, just a quick comment, which is that I think that's one reason that we're very glad we have a university-led effort, because we know that we're still in the early days and we don't want to leave learners in the lurch due to, just some versioning problem. We didn't know this sort of information, like this is the best way to express a thing. And so, the way that we're seeing it is, yes, we rely heavily on versioning technically to, make sure that people can continue to use old credentials, but that we're giving them access to the up-to-date version so that they can get the most value out of their credentials.
Sure, if we get 2 minutes left, so 1 minute for Matt, 1 minute for James. Matt? Final comment, Matt?
Sorry, I was muted. No, I don't. I guess the only other thing I think that we haven't talked about is thinking more about the terms we use. And if we're really going to drive adoption and get a lot of people to buy into something like this, Kim mentioned this earlier, but a lot of the terms we use come out of cryptocurrency. And for the average person, don't mean anything to them. So I do think as we move forward, I don't know the answer to some of these questions, but there are terms that we're using like issuer and wallet and even credentials that don't mean much to the layperson. So I do think as a community, we've got to agree on some of that stuff too.
And James, we're out of time, but any last word?
Oh, I'll just say thank you. It's been great. Very enjoyable.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, James. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Kim, Chris, Taylor, Duncan, the whole Learning Economy group. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in a month.
Yeah. Well, actually, and let me say one final thought here. I know we're up on time. There were a lot of questions we didn't get a chance to answer. I can't promise this, but I'm going to attempt to send those questions around, and maybe we can follow up with an email on those. So I want to thank everybody for coming. Again, be with us on the third Friday from next month, and we're going to have another great discussion. So everyone enjoy your Friday.
Terrific. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.